Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, a program dedicated to exploring the contributions of archaeologists who work in the Middle East to our understanding of and of appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark. I direct the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, and am joined by a star-studded group of fellow archaeologists and biblical studies individuals. Co-host, Dr. Larry Geraty, former president at La Sierra, longtime archaeologist. Dr. Kendra Haloviak-Valentine, who is a professor of New Testament studies, also at La Sierra, and somebody who's been engaged, at least sort of brushing alongside archaeology for a little bit. And then Dr. Kent Bramlett, who's associate professor of archaeology and the history of antiquity at La Sierra. Larry and Kent both connected with the center. Kendra, you're welcome to come to the center. We don't have office space right now, but sometime when the interest in archaeology continues to grow, we'll make space for you.
I always feel welcome. Thank you.
You must. So we have happily been working our way through the Bible, book by book, but actually it's section of books by section of books. And we've turned our attention now to the New Testament and to the Gospels. And Kendra, you've been helpful helping us think about kind of the background of the Gospels. We've been putting some archaeology together with it, and we hope in the process that that has helped provide some background that might inform our reading and our study of the Scripture too. This time we are thinking about the Gospel accounts having to do with the youth, the infancy and the youth of Jesus. We could have gone straight into Matthew and maybe do a couple of episodes in Matthew and then go straight into Mark and do some, but we'd be repeating ourselves, especially with the Synoptic Gospels. So we're taking these sections. So now it's kind of the early years of Jesus. And so we want to pay attention to those. As much as we can know, there are only 4 chapters biblically that deal with the childhood and youth of Jesus.
Although there are a lot of other traditions, aren't there?
And we will find some others as we think about it. Have you ever, I mean, you've all been raised in traditions that celebrate Jesus and celebrate Jesus' birth. Have you wondered much ever about the childhood and what he did as a teenager, how he survived his teenage years?
I have.
Wow.
Yeah, I have. I remember when I first learned that there were these other books, Gospels about his childhood and youth, and I was probably not a teenager yet, and I was so fascinated. I have to admit, I was a little disappointed when I read them. I was less than convinced, but I wasn't the only one who had that question. I think people through the ages have been fascinated by those quiet years, according to the Gospels.
To the biblical, certainly to the biblical record.
Right.
So. Well, we will have occasion to look at what others have said, but the biblical record too. And we'll do this in the context of archaeology. We have some artifacts on the table in front of us. Kent, would you begin? This may not be something you do normally with some of the artifacts in front of you, but
I thought maybe you were going to show us some books first.
I'm going to do that right after. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for the reminder.
Okay.
Well, this is a vital part of daily life in the past, making your clothes. You start with the basic ingredients, right? Wool for the coarser materials. Wool was the most plentiful material for clothing in the Old Testament period. They only had flax and wool or else leather. Cotton doesn't come along from India until, well, I guess the Syrian records mention it in around 700 and about that. Wool, which grows on trees, they called it. They didn't have a name for it. But wool, of course, is very scratchy. And so linen, and I point here at these very fine spindle weights. They'd be put on a fine shaft, and then you could spin them, much like this is a much larger spinning shaft for wool. And linen, of course, comes from flax. The stalks are cut, they're retted or soaked in water for a while, and then they extract the fibers. And so this represents a part of life which we take for granted. We go to all of our superstores and just buy clothing impossibly cheap compared to in the past what people would have spent laboring to grow or raise the fibers, spin it into threads or yarn, and then weave the cloth from that, and then sew the clothing.
Would you find most of this in a typical household in Nazareth as Jesus was being raised?
Absolutely. Just about every house we excavate that has an intact occupation layer in it that was preserved shows evidence of textile production.
Then we have a few more things coming this way, Kent. An inscription, looks like some lamps.
The lamp certainly would also be something that you would find in every household. Light was expensive, but light was necessary. You used it sparingly. And these are the everyday sorts of lamps that you would find. They might use a metal lamp in more special contexts, or a multi-wicked lamp, multi-spouts. But these are the typical Herodian lamps from the time of Jesus. And of course, inscriptions are not so common. And yet they are much more prevalent in the New Testament time period than in earlier years. So we are more than happy to make use of any fragment of an inscription that we find.
We can put students onto these too. If we've got a Greek inscription, sometimes we teach Latin, we can put students on those too. So, Larry, it looks like some specialized,
We have some
delicate things in front of us.
glass, yes, which in the Iron Age, they had a certain kind of glass toward the end of the Iron Age, but blown glass comes in during the Hellenistic period. And but these are Roman examples of blown glass that would be relatively common because when, as we know who are digging in this period, even in Jordan, we find glass ubiquitous.
Yeah, it is around.
Right, but it's for ointments and oils and specialized things like that. Yeah.
So you're suggesting that these might be found in a socioeconomic scale fairly broad then?
Right, right. Of course, there's some that are very, very expensive.
More
It would
the
be
elite.
exclusively to the elite. Right. Yeah.
And then what we have coming from the glass, all of the ceramic materials.
Vessels. Yeah.
Fairly common materials. We have a bowl and this flask. We call this a flask, like a canteen.
Right.
Put a strap around it and carry it. And then something for very fine oil, maybe perfume, something like that. And then the sort of normal sorts of things you'd find around the kitchen. Except this one. This one is interesting because it has a very small hole perforated in the top, and then some others, which suggests that this would take liquid slowly, but you could carry it around. It was mobile. You could take it around and not spill it. One does think about the parables of the, especially of the 10 virgins and the extra oil that the that the 5 maidens had.
You can
So,
still purchase vessels that are something like this, with this kind of handle and spout, and we give them out to our staff members on a dig on occasion. And why do we do that?
This is a little bit larger than this because there's such great water coolers.
Right.
Because there are minerals in the clay that allows the water to seep, and it just keeps it cool. And it's fresh. It tastes fresh. That's the only kind of water I use out on site, is in the ubrique,
Right.
we call it today.
And when you lift it up and you have to drink without closing your lips, people find that a challenge. So they practice sometimes in their swimming suits to get that just right.
Well, and that way you don't touch the lip anyway.
That's right.
You don't
That's
touch
right. You
the,
can pass it
spout.
around, and you're not passing around anyone's germs.
Okay, books. You mentioned books, Larry.
Yeah.
I'm going to just mention a few, and these because they might be helpful for people thinking about the New Testament. This one, and then we'll have a separate photo of it to show on the broadcast. But this one, archaeology and the New Testament. There are lots of archaeologies in the New Testament. This one by John McCrae is easy to get into, it's accessible, and it covers quite a bit of the New Testament material. Does it in a different sort of way, so it doesn't go just book by book. It does it in different
I
categories.
happened to write the preface for
You
that book.
did.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Congratulations. It's a great book. And then another one, this is a set of 2. It's called Galilee. One is on the archaeological record from cities, towns, and villages. So this goes to these different locations. And the other one is on basic cultural remains. So Galilee in the late Second Temple period and the Mishnaic period. It's moving into Judaism. moving into Judaism's second expression, I guess we could say. And then this one is fun. It's by Jody Magnus, well-known classical archaeologist. Stone and Dung, Oil and Spit. Jewish daily life in the times of Jesus. This one is focused on and centered around ritual law. So that one senses, when you've read her book, one senses that ritual law governed everything in Judea, because people are thinking about what's appropriate and what's going to be unclean and what's going to carry uncleanness and what won't. So that's an interesting book to get.
When she lectured at La Sierra, she was very popular, wasn't she?
She was.
Yeah.
She's a great lecturer. She'll be back.
Yeah.
So talking about Herod and Masada, Herod the Great. Now this one, Palestine in the time of Jesus, it's a bit more strongly or heavily academic, but it has to do with social and society structures. Right. And if one wants to get into the setting of the time of Jesus, something like this is helpful too. So lots of good reading material for people who want to do something more and go beyond what we're doing here. So some illustrations, some slides. Let's take a look at chronology. Kent, we've kind of narrowed it down this time. Who do we have on the slide this time?
Well, just the Herods. We have Herod the Great and then his sons who succeeded him.
Right. So we're not worried about when the materials we're talking about were written. We're talking about the time when these events took place.
Right.
So,
And the sons weren't sequential, but they ruled at the same time in different territories.
in different places, right. A map, 2 places identified. Larry, why would we put this on a slide for talking about Jesus's early years? Why would we circle these 2 sites?
Well, obviously we have the place of his birth, which was in Judea, and the place where he grew up in Galilee, Nazareth. And then you can see the surrounding territories that are mentioned in the Bible. They had to either go through Samaria or cross the Jordan River and go through Perea and the Decapolis. And those are all mentioned in the New Testament.
Now, the third site that we might have put on this map is Egypt. I mean, it's off the map, but we might have put an arrow, but it's easy enough to know where it is.
It's down in the bottom left-hand corner there at the beginning of it.
And we will be talking a little bit about it because of strong traditions from Christians from Egypt and the royal family's visit. So Jesus as a child, and we'll take a look at that and think about at least that perspective. Kendra, 4 chapters in the Gospels talk about something about Jesus' birth and young life. What are in these chapters?
One of the things that students are often surprised by is that, except for one incident where Jesus is 12 years of age, we really don't have anything about Jesus between his birth and when he is an adult starting his ministry. So we're grateful for these 4 chapters. And Matthew 1 and 2 has a lengthy genealogy, setting us up to realize Jesus is connected to the story of the Jewish people in many different ways. And I would suggest that even when you move past the genealogy, that Matthew is still wanting us to think about the ways in which Jesus is connected to the Jewish story. As he talks about a miraculous birth, as he talks about going into Egypt and coming back out of Egypt. You can't help but be thinking about the Jewish story and Moses in particular. So Matthew 1 and 2, his genealogy, his birth narrative, focusing on the sort of the story of Jesus' birth through Joseph's perspective. And then in Luke's gospel, it's more through his mother Mary's perspective. Luke's gospel starting first of all with a narrative of his cousin, which we don't know about till later in the story, but his cousin John the Baptist and his miraculous birth, and then moving into the story of Jesus' miraculous birth. So 2 nativity stories, if you will, 2 infancy narratives in the Gospel of Luke.
And genealogy in Luke?
There is one, but it happens just before Jesus is baptized. So it's not just before he's born. We suddenly hear his genealogy at the time of his baptism.
And the variations that everybody notices between them could be explained, at least in part, because of the different places the genealogy is put. I mean, preparing us for the next part of the story.
Correct.
Is that a fair kind of assessment?
Some people would mention that. Some would talk about it in terms of Mary's genealogy versus Joseph's. But most people would connect it to the narrative itself and how it's highlighting what we should expect through the rest of the story.
Now, in Matthew's genealogy, something about women, maybe unexpected women.
Unexpected women, women that you might not have necessarily wanted to include in your genealogy, but they are there. And what does that teach us? And what does that mean? Also, a very interesting setup between talking about 14 generations, 14 generations, 14 generations. It's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, archaeologists, that 14 is an important sort of kingly number for the Jewish people. So again, very carefully crafted, those two genealogies.
Right. Okay, thank you. Let's think then about some archaeological overlay with the contents you've just described. Daily life, that has become almost a sub-discipline in archaeology, whether it's Mesopotamia, whether it's Egypt, whether it is the Iron Age, Old Testament, whether it is the New Testament world, Greece, Italy. Daily life seems to be a very prominent thing, and that's one of the reasons we show the artifacts that we do.
And I think it should be said that you've become sort of a specialist at an earlier period about daily life in a specific house that we excavated in Jordan, a 4-room house.
And that was such a great introduction to the whole, what I think we can almost call a genre now of archaeological research and writings on daily life. Even Jody Magnus's book, Daily Life in the Time of Jesus. So we have a lot of those. And in the process, we learned something about socioeconomic conditions and situations. Then there is the question that probably is not a burning question for lots of people, but it's an interesting one. The Holy Family's travels in Egypt. I mean, they did go to Egypt, right? So Jesus and, well, Jesus' parents take Jesus for fear of whom? Is this the Herodian slaughter of the innocents and so on? So what did they do in Egypt? Well, we have some suggestions in any case. And then we've already talked a little bit about genealogies and how they might fit into the accounts you've talked about. A place can't you like to study and visit is Egypt. Have you ever been on an itinerary or a pilgrimage following the sites according to the Egyptian Coptic traditions of where the Holy Family visited? Have you done that?
I haven't been through all those sites. The Wadi Natrun in the Delta area has some great monasteries that commemorate some of the events. But it's interesting how the Coptic tradition sort of wants to create a narrative connecting all of the sites through Egypt, almost like a Via Dolorosa concept of following the last events of Jesus' life. So they do. They have this sequence of sites that proceeds through the Delta, through up the Nile River, quite a ways, and ties together then these early events in sort of a devotional sort of expression of the historical memories.
None of the Christian communities wanted to be left out, so they found a way to include all of them.
Well, and names. I mean, there is a monastery of the Virgin Mary halfway up the Nile River. These names, of course, come from later, but there's a purpose. And Coptic, you mentioned the word Coptic. What does that mean? We're talking about Coptic Christians.
Right. Well, it's one of the earliest branches of Christianity. Goes back well before the full development of Catholicism or the Orthodox Eastern varieties. It's sometimes been called monophysite. So it goes back to an early division in trying to describe what was Jesus physically, the substance of a divine human. But it's fully Christian. And it just preserves this tradition going back 2,000 years. 10% of Egypt is still Christian.
Right.
Right. And a significant story about Jesus as a child. So we have some images that come from Egyptian sources. This a map of the Delta. You talked about the Delta and some of the sites you may have visited there. You can see kind of an entry from the right-hand side, middle of the slide. And then these icons, these images, which are everywhere. I had a Coptic Christian from Egypt staying in my house for a time, and he felt that to give us a gift, a nice gift, he gave me a book. I think he may have even provided some of the illustrations because he was an artist, of all of these visits. So they're serious about this, and it's important to their tradition to think about the visits.
Even the donkey in the boat.
Right. This one is a fun one. There, the donkey is kind of doing what donkeys normally do on dry land. And these, water is typically there because of the Nile, and typically Byzantine. So these are from later times, but they're still celebrating something that, at least in a good portion of Christianity, seemed very real. As part of the youth and childhood. And I don't know, Kent, you said that some of these stories, of course, we're getting to some of the other stories, that some of these other stories did not satisfy you.
That's true. That's true.
So,
But I think most of these that are commemorated in Egypt, one could identify with. Whether or not the sequence of locations probably doesn't apply to a...
I like the size of the fish compared to the pyramids.
Yes.
So we will then turn for our explorations into the early years of Jesus to some of the non-biblical ones, Kent, your favorites, and the infancy Gospels, and we'll include in that the Gospel of Thomas, because there are several. Are there lots of these? There are enough for people to write books about them, so we have them. And the Gospel of Thomas is going to show up prominently in these, as you see in the left side one. Gospel of Judas. I don't know anything about the background of the Gospel of Judas. Is this one of those manuscripts in part of the debate about the marriage of Jesus and Mary Magdalene? I don't know, but there certainly are traditions connected with that. So, the Gospel of Thomas. Kent, looks like a papyrus manuscript here. Where does it come from?
Well, it comes from, I guess our fullest manuscript comes from Nag Hammadi, location in Egypt, and the discovery of that trove of manuscripts opened our eyes to a period of Christian history when there were different kinds of interpretations. Later, it became condemned as a heresy, the Gnostic elements in many of the books from Nag Hammadi. Thomas, though, is interesting, and I think you'll probably tell more about that, but it probably preserves some original sayings of Jesus.
Well, let's look at them. And there are enough here. I think we ought to at least read it. This is from the first part of the Gospel of Thomas. And so there are a number of miracles listed. And then the section is divided up into two major groups of miracles, in which there are two groups of three miracles. So, Kendra, let's go down to the section there under the first group. What kinds of miracles are tied there?
Well, Jesus breathes life into birds fashioned from clay, and this is a child Jesus.
Right.
He curses a boy who then becomes a corpse. This is where my students begin to have trouble with this particular story.
And maybe Kent did too.
Then curses a boy who falls dead and his parents become blind. And then there's an attempt to teach Jesus, which fails, while Jesus instead does the teaching.
As a child.
As a child.
As a child.
Right.
So, interesting stories. But let's complete what the Gospel of Thomas has to say about it. Kent, what do we have in this first set of three?
Well, miracles, he reverses his earlier acts. He resurrects the friend who fell from the roof. Heals a man who chopped his foot with an axe.
So these are positive. We've got these negative things that happen, and then the positive. Larry, what happens at the second group?
Well, he carries water on a cloth and produces a feast from a single grain. Later on, he feeds the 5,000, right, and the 3,000.
there you go.
So there's the first one. Stretches a beam of wood to help his father finish constructing a bed.
That would be helpful.
Very helpful.
And the father attempts to teach Jesus, which fails, with Jesus in turn doing the teaching.
And again, can't finish these off.
There's miracles. Heals James from snake poison. He resurrects a child who died of illness and resurrects a man who died in a construction accident.
So, really interesting stories. It would be so much fun, I think, to explore why these stories and what they said to the communities that first heard them. I have no idea what that would be, but it's an attempt to cover those quiet years. Well, there is an image of making of the clay birds, which then he breathes life into them. A couple of locations we have time to look at. First of all, going to Bethlehem, a nice view of the skyline of the city. But then we get to a place called the Church of the Nativity. When people go to visit the Holy Land, this is always on the route. So how about inside? Can we expect anything here genuine? Okay, so if we go inside through a cave entrance to the place where at least the tradition of the now this is Catholic or Orthodox?
This is Orthodox,
This is
right?
Right.
You know, it's the oldest standing church in the Holy Land.
And then that's correct. And then the place where Jesus actually was born in the tradition. So, is this accurate, or can one say that it would be very hard to know where Jesus was actually born? It is in a cave, or where would we go with this?
Be hard to know. But as Kent said, it goes back to the 4th century, including some of the mosaics. And most of them are 10th century, but there's some that originally go back to the time of Constantine's mother, who identified the site after she was told about it and started construction.
So how do we relate to places that claim significance for times that we just don't read about and we don't know? How do we do that? How do we relate to that? Is there a kind of an automatic academic skepticism that arises, or is there a kind of a devotional takeover that it may or may not be, but it's certainly interesting to stand here?
Well, some of these places for sure are original, but many of them have been created in order to make a pilgrim's trip worthwhile. And when a pilgrim spent all their resources to go to the Holy Land once, they wanted to see where various things had happened. And so the people who lived there learned that if they identified a site and built a church, these pilgrims would leave happier and more content. And so many of those have
probably made a huge difference. A positive.
There's often a political overtone to things, too. The silver star on the screen started the Crimean War in the Latin West, siding with the Ottoman Empire and the Orthodox Russians, and the star got pulled out and taken away, and it was a huge international
incident.
Yeah.
When I stood there several years ago, I had two emotions. There was this part of me that said, how could anyone know for sure this is the spot? But then this other part of me said, how many thousands of people have come and been blessed by this spot as pilgrims? So it was that mixture of that this is a sacred space, whether we can prove or not that this is where Jesus was born. This is indeed a sacred space.
Right.
And we pay attention to that.
Yes.
We won't have time to finish the other parts this time, maybe next time. Thank you, Larry, Kendra, and Kent. And joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We hope this has provided something for you to think about and to increase your faith, and we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring.